Catherine, thank you for joining. Just before we start, can you just say greetings so we can make sure your audio is working?
Can you hear me?
Absolutely.
Great.
Okay, so I'm over now. Thank you so much. And we'll see each other all on Zoom. Anisha.
Thank you. Thank you, Sandy. Okay, well, we'll get started. So welcome everyone to today's media briefing, unpacking the redistricting session and what's next in the fight for fair maps in Alabama. I'm Anisha Hardy. I'm the Executive Director of Alabama Values, which is a state-based communications hub, pretty much that seeks to amplify the efforts of grassroots and civic organizations that are on the ground working to build power and break down barriers to civic participation in communities across the state. I will be your moderator today. Today's briefing is made possible via a collaboration with our partner, Ethnic Media Services, and a copy of today's briefing and speaker bios will be sent to all attendees after the briefing. Also, a special thank you to Ethnic Media Services. This briefing will be simultaneously interpreted in Spanish, Mandarin, and Korean. So we ask that our speakers speak slowly, and each speaker will have 5 to 7 minutes to share. And we ask that reporters please place your questions in the chat box, and we'll be sure to pull a few questions after each presentation. So why are we here? So redistricting is a once-in-a-decade process to draw new district maps to account for the state level population changes in states from the federal level to the local level, and ultimately impacts how funding is distributed for core community, issues such as healthcare, schools, and other, much needed services. Well, on November 3rd, Alabama legislators, passed their new maps, despite concerns from grassroots and civic, organizations that highlighted the lack of transparency and accountability and accessibility during the process. And today, we are joined by some of our partners who are on the ground continuously advocating for fair maps. We'll be joined by Jack Gimberg, who is a senior staff attorney for the Southern Poverty Law Center, and that is working on redistricting litigation. Jack will discuss the significance of the Alabama's 2020 redistricting cycle and just discuss how, some of the ramifications that we're seeing as these maps were passed out of the legislature. We're also joined by Felicia Scalzetti, who is a Crowd Fellow with the Alabama Election Protection Network. And Felicia will highlight, we'll further discuss the 4 maps that were passed out of the legislature, and we'll just discuss how these maps further dilute the voice of minority communities. We'll also be joined by Kadita Stone, who is a data manager for Alabama Forward. And Kadita will unpack the special session for us and discuss just some of the lack of transparency and accountability and accessibility that we saw during the sessions. And then we'll also be joined by Catherine Sedazian, who is the redistricting counsel for the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. And Catherine will share, what's next in the fight for fair maps and redistricting litigation and potential outcomes. So at this time, I will ask Jack if you will come off mute.
Hi, thank you.
And share. Thank you. It's all yours, Jack.
Okay, great, thanks. So, hi, my name is Jack Gemberg. I'm a senior staff attorney at the Southern Poverty Law Center. My work is focused on ensuring that communities of color in Alabama and other Deep South states have a fair opportunity to participate in the political process and that their votes are not diluted by unfair or unlawful redistricting plans. So the process by which legislators in Alabama determine the boundaries of political maps for Alabama's members of Congress, state legislators, and local representatives is called redistricting. Now, redistricting maps affect access to equitable representation and resources. And when communities of color have access to fair and equitable representation, they ultimately are able to secure their fair share of resources and improve schools, rebuild roads, and provide better healthcare. Because redistricting happens only once every 10 years, unlawful redistricting maps harm communities of color for a decade. So the Constitution guarantees everyone in America is represented by political districts that are equal in population number and are not racial gerrymanders. When race is the predominant factor in drawing districts' lines, and the use of race is not narrowly tailored to comply with the Voting Rights Act or justified by any other compelling governmental interest, the district is an unconstitutional racial gerrymander. During the last redistricting cycle, a federal court found that 12 of Alabama's state legislative districts were racially gerrymandered in violation of the United States Constitution. Unfortunately, Alabama has once again racially gerrymandered many of its state legislative districts. In a complaint filed yesterday in federal court, Greater Birmingham Ministries, the Alabama State Conference of the NAACP, and several Alabama residents who live in these racially gerrymandered districts brought suit challenging their constitutionality. The Southern Poverty Law Center, American Civil Liberties Union, ACLU of Alabama, NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund, and the law firm. Yes,
I'm sorry to cut. If you can just speak a little slower than usual for our interpreters. Okay. Thank you.
Yes, no problem. So the Southern Poverty Law Center, American Civil Liberties Union, ACLU of Alabama, NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund, and the law firms Hogan Lovells and Wiggins, Childs, Pantasis, Fisher, and Goldfarb are representing the plaintiffs in this case. Alabama's redistricting maps intentionally pack and crack Black communities in the state, denying them the equal protection of the laws. In districts where Black voters are packed, Black voters are able to elect their preferred candidates, but those candidates win by large margins, and there are fewer Black voters available to vote in other districts. In other racially gerrymandered districts, Black voters are cracked. Where Black voters are cracked, their numbers are kept low enough that they are prevented from electing their candidates of choice. The result of packing and cracking is to reduce the voting strength of people of color so that voters of color are not able to elect their candidates of choice as often as they would be able to if districts were drawn fairly and legally. Alabama's racially gerrymandered redistricting maps have once again highlighted the importance of new federal legislation like the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act to restore the protections of Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. This is the first redistricting cycle since 1960 without the protections of Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. Section 5 required states like Alabama with records of racial discrimination in voting to submit any voting-related changes, which include redistricting plans, to the federal government for approval. In the 2013 decision in Shelby County v. Holder, the Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act after Congress, including Senators Jeff Sessions and Richard Shelby of Alabama, had voted overwhelmingly to reauthorize Section 5 just 7 years earlier. Restoring the Voting Rights Act is central to any effort to build a representative democracy in which people of color can elect candidates of choice and communities of color have access to equitable representation and resources. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jack. Before we move on, I will just want to make sure that we did not have any questions. We will also allot, if time permits, a question at the end. But again, we ask we ask the audience to place any questions in the chat, and we'll pull some of those after each presentation. Okay.
There's a question, Anisha, from a reporter I got on my text, asking if Alabama's immigrant populations and other communities of color have experienced being cracked and packed, as has the Black population. Could Jack speak to that?
Okay. And I think also we'll get to that also with, I can ask Felicia Scalzetti to come on. I think that she's going to actually discuss the cracking and packing in the maps. Hold on.
Yeah. So historically, there has been really discrimination in the state of Alabama against voters of people of color generally. Absolutely.
Okay. Okay. And again, we'll highlight that more, discussing what the maps, look like, the maps that were passed out once we get to Felicia Scalzetti. And Felicia, I think we have time if you want to jump in and just answer that question.
Hi, everyone. My name is Felicia Scalzetti. I'm a redistricting fellow with the Alabama Election Protection Network. The very brief answer is that yes, they are gerrymandered. There are different levels of harm depending on which map we're talking about, and I will go into more detail on that later. With regards to immigrant populations, typically when these maps are drawn and they are talking about minority representation, they're typically talking about Black voting age populations. And I think that along with the lack of concern for communities of interest and keeping communities of interest whole, I think that immigrant populations and non-citizens are not taken into account, that the effect of these maps on those populations are not adequately looked at or thought about at all.
Okay. Thank you, Felicia. Okay, and Felicia, you can just stay on because at this time we'll hear from Felicia Scalzetti with the Alabama Election Protection Network, and Felicia's going to discuss the 4 maps that were passed out of the legislature.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I should have just kept my camera on. So again, my name is Felicia Scalzetti. I'm here today on behalf of the Alabama Election Protection Network, which is a collaborative of nonpartisan grassroots organizations who are dedicated to upholding the core values of democracy. These organizations are the Ordinary People Society, Alabama Black Women's Roundtable, Friends of the West End, and Hometown Organizing Project. Our main concern with these maps is that they are not reflective of Alabama as a whole. The district lines make it appear that the maps are more reflective and improve communities of interest. A close examination shows the demographics of representation have not changed. There are no additional minority majority or minority opportunity districts in the congressional, state senate, and state board of education maps. There is one additional minority majority district in the Alabama State House map. However, this still does not represent equity for Alabama. So if we look at the actual numbers in the congressional map, only 1 of 7 congressional districts is majority Black voting age population, which represents only 14% representation, when in reality, Alabama has a Black voting age population of 25.9%. So we have a disparity in the actual representation. Republicans in the congressional map have 85% representation and Democrats have 14% representation. What I'm getting at here is that our Democratic districts and our Black majority districts are the same. And this is the case in each of the maps. So we have an issue with potentially partisan gerrymandering here as well. We've had, in addition to that, we've seen communities of interest being split in every map. I've noticed that the indigenous reservations, for example, are split in almost every map. And in the House, every single state recognized indigenous reservation has been split. So there was just a lack of concern for what these maps did to communities of interest. The ratio of the number of districts that Black Alabamians are represented in that are majority minority districts are the same from 2011. The only difference was in the House map, and it was only an increase of 1 seat, which did not represent equity. So just fundamentally, we do not have equity in this map, and this map just keeps the core of the the racist maps of 2011. Unfortunately, we are continuing to pursue civic engagement. We have a Contact Your Legislator initiative. If you go to voteprotection.org and click Contact Your Legislator, we are encouraging people to reach out, whether you are part of the immigrant community, whether you are a minority, whether you vote, whether you don't, whether you are registered, whether you are formerly or currently incarcerated, you deserve accurate representation. That's what redistricting is supposed to be. It's not supposed to be just about political lines. And so we're encouraging everybody to reach out and to take that step, and to express our fundamental disagreement with these lines. I also would like to let everyone know that this process is ongoing on the city level, city councils, and on the county commissioner level. For example, today, Autauga County will be holding a public hearing on redistricting and will likely pass their county commissioner maps at the end of it. This is the only public hearing they're having. Auburn City, or City of Auburn, is doing something similar. And I know there's a large Asian American population around Auburn, so that might be of particular interest to all of you. They are currently undergoing the redistricting process, and they're having an open house on Thursday. They'll be having one more open house on, I believe, December 6th, and then they will be tentatively voting in their maps on the 21st. This process is happening in every city and every county. Many counties are now done, and the process for informing people of those public hearings, if they have any, is very, very minimal. It's typically just a notice on their website, or sometimes physically printed out and put on the courthouse door. So I would urge attention to that, and for people to reach out to their local representatives as well, and to ask what that process is and how they can get involved with that process.
Okay. Felicia, thank you so much. Peter White from the Tennessee Tribune wanted to know could you speak a little bit about what the districts in Birmingham look like now?
I can speak quite a bit about it. So is there a particular map? Are you talking on the congressional, state house, state senate, or just sort of a quick overview? I live in Birmingham, so I can really wax for a long time on those maps. Overview. Okay, so Birmingham is less split on the congressional map, so there is a slight improvement there. However, overall, we are again, Birmingham is again split between more districts than it needs to be. We've seen overall a dilution of urban representation in these maps. You usually need to take a small slice of an urban area so that you don't have a massive rural district to get to the number of voters, but we just have this gone to the other extreme, where Birmingham, Huntsville, Mobile, Montgomery are split beyond what is needed to get to parity, to get to those equal populations. So what this does is it effectively dilutes voters in those areas by lumping them in with majority rural districts. It also has a unique impact in Alabama because of the lack of home rule, so that anybody on the state house or state senate map who has a piece of Jefferson County, which is the county that encompasses Birmingham, then gets to sit on the committee, which passes legislation specifically for that county. This is a uniquely Alabama phenomenon. And so there's that added political incentive to split up Birmingham and by extension Jefferson County as much as possible. And we've seen that continue.
Awesome. And someone wanted to know if we would say that gerrymandering in the maps, the current maps, is it worse than what we saw in 2011?
I wouldn't say it's worse. I would say it's about the same. I think that the maps have kept the core, and the legislator stated that that was a goal of theirs, to keep the core of the original districts when drawing new ones. When you do that, there's only so much leeway you can get. The issue is that, you know, Alabama is becoming increasingly diverse. We're becoming increasingly non-white. And as that continues, as we keep this core of these 2011 maps, that's going to become increasingly, you know, beyond past what we need for equity. So I would say at the moment, in this snapshot in time, they're about the same as 2011. But by the time we get to 2025, it's probably going to be worse, because we are going to increasingly be more diverse. If you just see how we're growing, you know, I think that this map sets us up for a very gerrymandered map, you know, 5, 6, 7 years down the line. These maps stay in place for 10 years. So we have to think ahead as well.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. And we will get to other questions as we move through the briefing. Next, we'll hear from Kadita Stone, who is also a Cloud Fellow and Data Manager at Alabama 4, which is the state civic table. Kadita will unpack the special sessions for us and just discuss what's happening on the ground. Kadita, if you could come off mute and just remember to speak slowly for our interpreters.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. Like Anisha said, I'm the Data and Training Manager of Alabama Forward, and as well as a Redistricting Fellow in partnership with Alabama Forward. And we are a membership-based coalition of civic engagement groups across the state, working to make sure that Alabama's democratic institutions are as accessible as possible to all who live here. It's super exciting to be here today. The decisions that were made during the redistricting cycle will affect Alabama for the next 10 years. And that's why it was so pertinent for the legislature to draw the lines in the correct manner for the sake of Alabamians. We've learned a lot of interesting things throughout this redistricting process. So for starters, when the census data dropped on August 12th, we learned that the population had grown by 5.1%. And in that population growth, it was evident that the population of BIPOC communities had increased. And the Black population specifically is now 25.9%. That Latinx population increased to 5.3%, and 2 or more races tripled to 5.1%. So that's a total of 36% for the BIPOC communities. So knowing that, the coalition sought to have more equitable representation in the maps that were drawn by the state legislator. So for example, the legislator would have needed to create 2 majority-minority districts to reach a percentage of representation that would be closely aligned with Alabama's BIPOC community population. So since 36% of Alabama's population consists of BIPOC communities, having 3 districts would have been a move in the right direction as well, which would have put the representation in Congress for people of color at 42%. At the beginning of the process, there were public hearings held across the state so that citizens of Alabama could give their input, but we quickly learned that many Alabamians across the state did not like the way that their maps were drawn 10 years ago, and they were asking that the legislature work harder this year in the 2021 to create more equitable maps and maps that made sense for Alabamians. And the people that spoke out came from all demographics and all had their own reasons for disliking the maps, but the theme was common. They wanted better representation for their communities. The most common complaint was the split amongst several districts, making it difficult for members of the community to know who represented them.
And Kadita, if you could just speak a little slower for me.
Oh, speak a little
Thank you so
slower.
much. Thank you.
Okay, I'm sorry. In the event of natural disaster, aid was delayed because there were too many representatives to get on the same page. Another thing that was brought up at the hearings were questions about if there could be a change in who drew these lines. So we know that currently the Alabama legislator is tasked to redrawing the lines. However, in other states, independent redistricting commissions have been appointed to handle the process. And Alabamians who spoke out and requested that same process be done here were shot down and told that it was out of the scope of the hearings. So creating fair maps and fair districts impact who we are able to elect. The people we elect impact the resources in our communities that we are able to have access to, such as quality education, quality healthcare, or just access to healthcare in general, public transportation, and even infrastructure. Fair maps also promote election integrity. If maps are drawn in a way where certain groups' political power are diluted in the process, the integrity of each election is compromised. If each person's vote does not carry an equal weight, the elections they participate in are hardly more than performative democracy. Equitable maps mean higher quality politicians. We all benefit from better representation, and when voters can choose their representatives and not the other way around. So during the special session, we heard several times from legislators that proposed maps outside of the ones passed out of the reapportionment committee were not okay because they pitted incumbents against one another. And that is a perfect example of when politicians select their representation. When politicians select their people. The decisions that were made during the redistricting cycle will affect Alabama for the next 10 years. And that's why it's, like I said earlier, important for the legislator to get those lines correct. We know that there is power in the collective, and our coalition partners have worked diligently together to help increase engagement in the democratic process, hold elected officials accountable, educate Alabamians on the redistricting process, and even submitted alternative map plans. So from social media messaging to redistricting trainings, to speaking at public hearings, to attending the special session, to emailing, texting, and making calls to legislators, we have worked day and night to fight for a better Alabama and to ensure that Alabamians have the proper tools and resources to fight with us. So collectively, coalition members held 5 community forums, 1 on the heels of the public hearing and 4 during special session. Through those forums, members of the community were able to get an analysis of the maps that coalition members had created. During the special session, participants also heard wrap-ups from things that happened during the legislative session. There were also nightly discussions of different maps from crowd redistricting fellows and even maps that other coalition partners brought forth. There was also discussion from partners about the environment, healthcare, education, and infrastructure, all of which are affected by redistricting. And some of the coalition redistricting experts took part in a Facebook Live episode with the NAACP Legal Defense Fund discussing redistricting in Alabama. And so coalition partners came together to express our dissatisfaction with the process, which it was a lack of accountability and as well as a lack of access to information and transparency. And the coalition partners shared those thoughts through a media release. Members of the coalition spoke at these committee hearings, urging the legislator to create two majority minority districts and to create fair and equitable maps. Alabama Values recorded the public hearings and the reapportionment committee meeting and the special session for the coalition, and any Alabamian who wishes to watch what went down. Even though the legislator did draw the lines in a way that somewhat represents Alabamians, we know that the fight is not over. Several lawsuits have been filed due to gerrymandering, and the legislator proved that the work that the coalition had been doing is very much needed And we will continue to collectively fight for an Alabama that is truly fair and equitable for all who call Alabama home. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Khadija. Someone wanted to know, I know you were talking about advocates and organizations that have been pushing for fair maps, that have been pushing for engagement and transparency. Where do you feel you have had the biggest impact, a lot of the coalitions, in terms of pushing for engagement and transparency?
You mean where geographically, or can you specify that question?
I'm assuming that they're asking, well, not geographically, maybe in terms of engagement and transparency, or people getting involved or becoming aware. Where do you feel you've had the most impact this redistricting cycle?
Because I wasn't a part of the last redistricting cycle, I do feel like this was a very engaged redistricting cycle. I know that some League of Women Voters is a organization that did a lot of these community hearings, community hearings after the special session was done. So, and I think on a few of those calls, it was over 200 people that showed up. So that's just one example. But I do feel like people were heavily engaged in a way that I hadn't seen before.
Awesome. Okay. And we have, I do see a few questions that I think will also be answered during our next speaker's presentation, but definitely want to move to Catherine Sedacian, the Redistricting Counsel for the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, who's going to discuss what's happening next in the fight in redistricting litigation and potential outcomes. And then we'll circle back around to some of the questions that weren't answered. Catherine, if you could come off mute. Thank you so much, Khadija.
Here I am. Thank you so much. And thank you as well, Khadija. So as Anisha said, my name is Catherine Sedacian. I'm a redistricting counsel at the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund. As you heard, this is Alabama's first redistricting cycle without the protections of Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, which was struck down in Shelby County versus Holder, which was a Supreme Court case that found that the coverage formula that required certain jurisdictions with a history of discrimination be totally covered by the Voting Rights Act affirmative protections to prevent voting changes at any level of government in one of the covered states from going into effect prior to a determination by either the Department of Justice or in federal court that the voting plan or measure didn't negatively affect Black voters in voting strength. So between 1965 and 2013, at least 100 voting changes proposed by either the state of Alabama or a county or city officials were either blocked or altered under Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. So that included 16 objections from 1969 to 2008, in which the state or local jurisdiction proposed a redistricting plan, the purpose or effect of which would have affirmatively diminished the voting power and the political participation of Black Alabamians. So even though the Supreme Court's decision in Shelby County versus Holder abolished the coverage formula for Section 5, the Voting Rights Act, Section 2, continues to apply in full force in Alabama, and that also prevents electoral maps and voting changes that have a disparate effect on Black or other people of color voters or other minority communities, that those laws, if they have either the intent or the purpose or the intended or purpose or the effect of diluting Black political power or minority political power, then those still violate Section 2. But now, as a result of Shelby County, those voting laws, including redistricting maps, go into effect immediately without the kind of prior determination by the DOJ or a federal court that they don't have this disparate effect. So this means that any and all elections between when a voting law is passed, or in this case, redistricting maps, are thereby influenced by the law despite its compliance with the Voting Rights Act. And so I think what the rush process in the Alabama legislature this year really highlighted is that, whereby the legislature adopted all of the statewide redistricting maps in a one-week special session. It highlighted the state of Alabama's failure to comply with the Voting Rights Act and the continued need for the Voting Rights Advancement Act to bring Alabama back under the affirmative protections of the Voting Rights Act. So for
Catherine,
example,
could you just speak a little slower for me? Thank
sure.
you so much.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry, it's hard.
Yeah.
A lot to cover. But so for many of you who know, during this special redistricting session of the Alabama legislature, Alabama Forward and a number of other groups affirmatively asked members of the legislature whether they had conducted the required analysis under the Voting Rights Act to determine where additional majority minority districts may be required. And all of the committee members that were asked, affirmatively stated that they had not conducted what we call a racially polarized voting analysis before packing Congressional District 7 and then cracking the Black populations across Congressional Districts 1, 2, and 3, and then finally failing to create a second majority minority opportunity district in the congressional map. So yesterday, LDF, the ACLU of Alabama, Wiggins Childs, and Hogan Lovell filed 2 federal cases, Milligan versus Merrill, challenging HB 1, the congressional map passed by Alabama, and then Thomas v. Merrill, so where we are including our co-counsel from SPLC as well in that challenge, which challenged SB 1 and HB 2, which enacted maps from the Alabama State Senate District and the Alabama State House District. Both of the lawsuits filed by LDF are in federal court in the Northern District of Alabama. In Milligan versus Merrill, LDF represents Evan Milligan, our own Khadijah Stone, Letitia Jackson, Adia Winfrey, Shalala Dowdy, and the Alabama State Conference of the NAACP and Greater Birmingham Ministries. Milligan versus Merrill is a case challenging the congressional map enacted by Alabama under the Voting Rights Act and the US Constitution. We're seeking a remedy that will allow Black preferred candidates to win election in 2 of the 7 US congressional districts in Alabama. Currently, Black people are only able to elect candidates of choice in Congressional District 7, which was created in 1992 following litigation under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. And so this actually, as Felicia had said, this amounts to about a 14, or maybe it was Kadia, about 14% representation for BIPOC communities in the US House, despite accounting for, if you include both Black and people who identify as Black in another race, 27% of the state's population. LDF also filed Thomas v. Merrill, again with our co-counsel in addition to SPLC, and other to represent individual voters in the gerrymandered districts across the state legislature. So that's the state Senate and the state House of Representatives, as well as that. And we also represent the Alabama State Conference of the NAACP and Greater Birmingham Ministries in that case as well. In Thomas v. Merrill, our case challenging the state legislative redistricting plans. We're challenging as racial gerrymanders several state House and state Senate districts that either pack Black voters in high numbers into particular districts or crack those Black voters among other districts to prevent them from being able to form a majority and to elect candidates of choice. So in addition to our lawsuits, several Black legislators filed litigation before the Alabama legislature passed new maps, alleging Alabama created a congressional map that was racially gerrymandered in 1992 and again in 2011, and that to remedy that racial gerrymander, which the state of Alabama admitted in litigation that it had racially gerrymandered Congressional District 7, this litigation is asking the federal court to preserve county boundaries, to not follow the Voting Rights Act necessarily in remedying the racial gerrymander. We anticipate in our litigation likely being joined with that litigation as well, just because we're both in the same federal district court. I should say that the Democratic Party, on behalf of several individual residents, filed litigation in the Middle District of Alabama in a case called Castor versus Merrill. Their case is also under Section 2, challenging the congressional map passed by the Alabama legislature in HB 1 on the grounds similar to our case that it strategically cracks and packs Alabama's Black communities, preventing the creation of 2 majority minority districts in violation of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. So having filed, we are now moving very quickly. We're on an expedited basis, particularly on the congressional map. And we anticipate being joined with the lawsuits brought by several Black legislators in Singleton versus Merrill, and possibly with the Democrats' lawsuit in the Middle District, which is Castor versus Merrill. The candidate qualifying deadline in Alabama for this upcoming 2022 redistricting or to election cycle is January 28th. And because of that, it's really important that we move as expeditiously as possible to secure a remedy for our clients so that when candidates run for election in various districts in the next election cycle, whether it be in congressional or state legislative districts, that they are able to run in the district or in a district that will actually be the same district that they elect to try to win election in. So our hope is that, particularly in the congressional map, we can obtain a remedy before the 2022 congressional elections to ensure that Black preferred candidates can win election in at least 2 of the 7 US congressional districts in Alabama's House of Representatives delegation. So we're also seeking a remedy to the racial gerrymandering of numerous state House and state Senate districts that gerrymander predominantly Black jurisdictions. And we are hoping to move as expeditiously as possible on that as well.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Catherine. And we have some questions that have come in. Someone wants to know, during the session, Representative Chris Pringle laid out the priorities for redistricting, including keeping the core of districts and protecting incumbents. What do you think should be the guiding principles for determining new district lines?
I'll just take that really quickly. I don't know if
you could speak slower than usual, that'd be great.
Yes, I don't really know how to speak much slower, but I am trying. So what guides the redistricting process, not just in Alabama, but in every state in the United States, is the US Constitution's requirement that one person's vote in one district should not weigh or should not be counted as more than one person's vote in another district. So that means that districts in a particular electoral map should be composed of roughly equal populations. So that is principle 1. There's some, kind of flexibility for state legislative maps, but as equal to, absolute equality of population between districts as possible. The second thing that is required in all US states, including Alabama, is that district maps comply with the Voting Rights Act. So that is where the totality of the circumstances where a number of social and political conditions of discrimination exist, where racially polarized voting exists. In other words, where people of a particular race vote for candidates of a particular race, and that those differ between voters of different races. So in other words, Black candidates tend to prefer, or Black people tend to prefer a particular candidate, which is different from the candidate of choice for white voters or other people of color. And that those white voters tend to vote as a block to defeat Black preferred and minority preferred candidates. And so when you have those conditions present, the Voting Rights Act and federal law require every US state to create districts where it is possible for a minority preferred candidate to win an election. And so in addition to those requirements that apply across the United States, there are also traditional districting principles that apply pretty solidly throughout the United States, and including kind of as embodied in the Voting Rights Act. And one of those is compactness. So the Voting Rights Act also requires districts to be potential majority minority districts to be compact. And what compactness means is that you don't have a bunch of tendrils sticking out that people are generally living in one kind of vicinity or nuclear location to be grouped together in a district. So compactness, contiguity is the next one, which means that you don't have, like, all pieces of the district have to touch one another. So you can't have Dothan by itself in a district with all of Montgomery County. So
Okay.
those are kind of examples of two traditional districting principles that similarly apply across the United States. I should say that incumbent protection is one of the least important principles of redistricting in print, because it is not the protecting the person who won an election previously should not be the goal of ensuring that voters in a state are well represented, because if they are the candidates of choice for the voters, then they will be voted back in their district without the protection of the legislature.
Okay, thank you. Okay, and at this time, if all of our presenters can come off mute and turn your cameras on, I'm gonna just go through some questions that we have here in the chat. So someone wanted to know if we could just provide a bare definition, like of the polarization study, what that is and what should have been done.
I can take that unless somebody else wants to. So racial polarization in voting is something that is required for a Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act case to be brought. The first kind of thing that you look at is whether or not there's a significant minority community that is reasonably compact. And the second two kind of considerations are what we call racially polarized voting analysis. And so the racially polarized voting analysis asks whether the minority community prefers candidates similar to one another. In other words, are they politically cohesive? Does the minority community prefer the same candidates? Do they vote for the same candidates? Do Black people tend to vote for a particular candidate, not just Democrats versus Republicans, but we look at kind of primaries, for example, where Black people vote for their preferred candidate and white people vote for their preferred candidate, and you see whether there is a breakdown along racial lines and who is the preferred candidate. So the first question is in this racially polarized voting analysis is the minority group politically cohesive? The second question is then, does the white voting majority vote as a block for preferred candidates and outvote the minority preferred candidate? So do you have a greater than 50% block of white voters voting consistently to defeat minority preferred candidates? And that kind of analysis is done using old election results, using particularly instructive elections. So where there's a Black candidate on the ballot and Black people actually get to select who is their preferred candidate, not necessarily among other candidates, like, white candidates that may not be as preferred by the Black community. And so that is important to know, because when you have racially polarized voting, Black people and minority communities more generally are more subjected to the negative effects of voting changes, because if you can kind of identify beforehand how a minority community is going to vote, knowing that they vote together, packing and cracking them along these kind of racial lines has more of an effect, is outcome determinative at the polls. And so by not conducting that racially polarized voting analysis, the state not only didn't know kind of the degree to which they were required to create additional majority minority opportunity districts, but it also didn't know what kind of the threshold of voters was necessary to allow Black people in Alabama to elect their candidates of choice. So in Congressional District 7, the legislature has packed about 55% of the district with a Black voting age population of 55%. But because the legislature didn't conduct a racially polarized voting analysis, that it only takes 50% plus one additional person to win an election. And so by arbitrarily creating a threshold of 55% Black voting age population in Congressional District 7, the legislature is just using race alone as a proxy. And that really is prohibitive, because if you don't know the actual voting patterns of Black people, then setting an arbitrary racial threshold as a target for a majority minority opportunity district is kind of on its face problematic.
Okay, thank you. Let's see, Felicia, this next question is for you. Let's see, we have Caroline Beck from the Alabama Daily News, and the question is, so during the session, there was a common complaint that we heard from Alabama Republicans about the congressional maps, that if two opportunity districts were drawn, that it will ultimately decrease the power of Black voters. And, you know, we would run a risk of losing one of those districts to a Republican anyway. What is your thoughts around this criticism?
I mean, top line is that it's an excuse, and a poor one at that. But there are a few nuances to that situation. So one is that, as Catherine was mentioning, there's sort of two camps. One is that you need 50% plus one to be a safe, you know, majority minority district. And the other camp, this is broad generalizations. And the other camp is that if you want to maximize, minority representation and being able to pick your candidate of choice, maybe you take that down to maybe 40%, and you would have more districts that you have a likelihood of electing your candidate of choice, especially if it's a competitive district, because then you would not be able to win that election without having that community behind you. That's also a critical factor. If you have, 40% minority district, but it's 80% Republican, then yeah, maybe they're right. And so this is a tension with drawing maps and with representation, is that there's a ceiling of how many 50% plus one districts you can draw, but if you bring it down a little bit, you might spread it out. However, we live in Alabama, and Alabama has a long history of voter suppression and of just issues with voting in general. We only have one day to vote. I mean, I'm not going to go through it. Y'all know exactly what I'm talking about. So there's that balance of what to do. So I don't think that it's fair to say, well, we'll risk losing one of those districts to a Republican anyway, because if you look at the congressional map, we've already just have one. If we lost the other one to a Republican, that's the same situation we're in right now, except in that hypothetical situation, we at least had the chance to pick up another one. I mean, it's all in how you draw it. The devil's in the details, but I don't find that a compelling argument against at least trying. Furthermore, we were able to draw, multiple people drew maps that had maybe not a second, outright majority minority district. So meaning that the districts were probably in like the 40% range of Black voting age population. But they were like a Democratic or competitive congressional district. We had multiple different examples of maps that did that. So they had a selection from which to choose from, or to get inspiration from, or however you want to phrase it, and they chose not to. And this is just an excuse for them.
Okay. Thank you. The next question, Brian Lyman from the Montgomery Advertiser points out how the last redistricting lawsuit in Alabama consumed the better part of 4 years. So with that in mind, what do we think would be a reasonable time frame for an expedited decision? Do we think it's possible to have a decision before November, or will this be a multi-year process in terms of the lawsuit?
I will take this first, particularly for the congressional, and Jack, I will leave to you to maybe address state ledge. But the litigation will take quite a while. We are on an expedited briefing timeline because of the candidate qualifying deadline on January 28th. But there are a number of phases to Section 2 litigation. For example, so there's like kind of the affirmative finding of liability, and then there is the remedies phase. And so there will be an opportunity for Alabama to draw its own maps in response to being found liable. And then, the court could get involved thereafter if Alabama kind of defaults or continues to pass or to suggest unconstitutional or unlawful maps. So we are talking about kind of a longer time frame than, we don't expect to necessarily have new maps in place by the January 28th qualifying deadline. It is true that litigation takes a very long time, and we are, particularly at LDF, very careful about framing our cases and, ensuring that we have enough facts at trial to sustain kind of a federal appellate bench that is not friendly to civil rights. So kind of balancing those two interests, we do expect to try to, at the very least, have a remedy in place for not the 2022 elections, but the next, but we are seeking a remedy for the 2022 congressional elections.
Okay. Thank you. Jack, did you
Yeah.
want to go ahead?
Sure. Essentially the same answer. Yeah, litigation does take time, although it's paramount that elections aren't taking place under unconstitutional maps. And we've challenged, along with Catherine's organization, LDF and ACLU, ACLU of Alabama, we've challenged, and with Kadita as a plaintiff, we have challenged the state legislative districts as unconstitutional racial gerrymanders. And it's very important that unconstitutional elections don't take place, and that voters aren't harmed in those districts, aren't harmed in that way. So we're hoping that things can move along the litigation, but it's not completely within our control. So we're hopeful that things will move along.
Okay. And there was a question, are voters in communities of color, and this reminds me, I did want to give a definition. We've heard the term BIPOC, and that stands for Black, Indigenous, People of Color communities. But the next question was, are voters in communities of colors more aware of the importance of redistricting now than in 2011? And how has that been measured, or has that been measured?
I might pass it. I think Kadita answered this as like with her, kind of forward work in this cycle. But I would just say that, in 2011, the Republican National Committee took a particular, 2000s, I guess, took a strong interest in redistricting and really carved up strategically the United States to ensure continued minority rule across the United States. And so I think in response to that, that particularly puts at risk Black voters in the South, where there is racially polarized voting. And so kind of in response to this wave of strategic and intentional minority rule work by the Republican committee in the last round of redistricting at LDF, we were very sober about what that meant and where racially polarized voting would make that particularly harmful to the communities that we represent. And so it's been a pleasure and a privilege to work with Evan and Kadita at Alabama Forward that really did the legwork of kind of making sure that people were involved in this process in Alabama.
Right. Thank you. And we have one more question, and then we'll go to kind of like closing remarks. So the question comes from, well, generally, given that, looking at the prospect for a successful lawsuit, given that the Supreme Court has said that political gerrymandering is acceptable, and then looking at the Democratic districts and the Black districts, in Alabama can be considered one and the same, how do we see the prospect for do we see a prospect for a legal victory, given that, like I said, the court has ruled that political gerrymandering is acceptable, but in Alabama, looking at the parties makeup.
I could start. I think we do, and there's a difference between gerrymandering based on partisanship and gerrymandering based on race, and gerrymandering based on race is unconstitutional, and that's what we're challenging here. So that's absolutely illegal to do so, lawful to do so.
Gotcha. And then also
really there was I'm so sorry. I just want to add that where there is racially polarized voting, that targeting Black communities, you can very easily say I'm targeting a particular party, but when you have racially polarized voting, when you know that particular people of color vote for particular candidates, I think we can kind of break down that this is about partisanship very easily, because it's attacking Black voters, the people that Black voters support. And oftentimes it's kind of, an atmosphere, occurs in an atmosphere where it's racially charged, there are racial campaign appeals, there's a history of discrimination. So whereas other places, I think, partisanship is, a real concern and something that is like, that can happen very easily and lawfully now, thanks to the Supreme Court. I think in Alabama, with respect to the history of discrimination and the racially polarized voting, targeting particular candidates who are targeting Black people.
Gotcha. Okay, and our final question, we'll ask that each presenter take about 20 to 30 seconds to just answer this closing question. But what message or story regarding redistricting would you like media outlets to share with the diverse communities that they serve? And we can start with Catherine, you, since you're on screen.
Yeah, I hope that you take away from this conversation that people, from Felicia, Khadija, to the organizations that they represent and have participated in, and Anisha across Alabama are very concerned and are paying attention and are ready to hold legislators accountable, not just in this cycle, but in future cycles, and that we are prepared to continue the battle in court because Alabama is a state with a long and well-documented and ongoing pattern of racial discrimination in all aspects of life, including and especially voting. So, this is not something where the political maps are going to be enacted and it is just okay. It is a continuation of that long pattern of racial discrimination, of marginalizing and disempowering Black people in the political process. And we will not stop until Alabamians, and particularly Black Alabamians, have an actual opportunity to elect candidates of their choice, not Democrats, of their choice in future elections.
Thank you. Okay, Felicia?
I'm going to combine my answer with something I believe Adriana just put in the chat, which was what should the Hispanic community, other minorities, and the Black community do before January 28th? And to that I say there's two things to do. One is to contact your legislators and let them know how upset you are about this process. So go to voteprotection.org and click on letter to legislator or send your letter. And the second thing is local redistricting. So again, all of this is still happening at your city council level and at your county commissioner level. A lot of counties have already passed their maps and we haven't even noticed. Every day I am calling counties to find out that they actually finished weeks ago and there wasn't a news article written about it because coverage of rural counties is difficult. I can't fault the media because I'm trying to play catch up as well. The best thing you can do, and those communities can do, and all of us can do, is to literally pick up the phone and bother your city council, your town council, your county commissioners, and find out what's going on. And then get together with your neighbors and with your community and start coming up with alternates to whatever their proposal is, or ahead of time. I am currently helping, I know Khadija is currently helping communities draw their own maps, but that does take time. And a lot of places there's not a lot of eyes on it, so they know that they can get this through quickly and without a lot of fuss. And they are generally prejudiced to keeping districts as close to how they originally were because that's the least amount of work. So if you have a town that's currently gerrymandered, or maybe 10 years ago it wasn't, but there's been a large influx of people. There's been a large immigrant population that's moved in. Other things have happened. It may now be gerrymandered, but they'll try to keep districts roughly the same, not out of malice, but just out of convenience.
Okay, thank you. Khadija, 20, 30 seconds. What message would you like, the media outlets to share with the diverse communities that they serve?
I think that I'm just going to echo what Catherine and Felicia said, to stay on the legislators and to stay on the city councilmen and stay on the county commissioners, and making them aware that that redistricting is happening and that you want to be a part of the process as much as anybody else. And given Alabama's history, redistricting always ends in litigation, and it should be a time where it should not be ending in litigation, because these are Alabamians' taxpayers' dollars that are going towards fighting these cases because they are choosing not to be fair. So that's something I definitely would like for the community to know, and to just stay abreast on this process as it's happening.
Okay, great. And Jack, close us out.
Sure. Well, redistricting matters. I encourage people to get involved, make your voices heard. These maps have real world effects, affect the resources that your community gets, affects the schools, the roads, healthcare. And so it's really important that the maps are ultimately fair and legal. And if you care about these maps, you care about the resource your community receives, then you should make your voice heard.
Thank you. That is our time for today. I want to be respectful of everyone's time. Thank you for joining us. As a reminder, our partners at Ethnic Media Services will send out a recording of today's briefing along with speaker bios. I encourage our media partners on the line today to contact the speakers and contact, the organizations that are on the ground doing this work and help amplify this work and tell your communities how to get involved and how to tap into this very important process. Thank you so much for joining us, and I hope everyone enjoy the rest of your day, evening, or wherever you are. Bye.